Hey, it's Elwin Robinson here, and today I am thrilled to be joined by Dr. Miriam Makitsky, normally shortened to Dr. Miriam. She is a medical doctor, a functional medicine doctor. She has credentials in a bunch of other systems, including Dr. Walsh's, which we did an episode on a few weeks ago. And today she's going to be sharing part two of her advanced longevity strategies, because she actually has a clinic now which is specifically focused to helping people with anti-aging, life extension, longevity, and she has a lot of experience with it. And so this is obviously something that we're interested in here in the Rejuvenate podcast. There's a heavy overlap, so I wanted her to share as many of her strategies as she could, and she's here to do that in this episode today. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Miriam.
Thank you for having me, Elwin, and it's great to be back.
Okay, well, let's get straight into it. So in the last episode, we talked about, so we've done several actually in this series. So first of all, we talked about like the causes of what stops a person living longer and what causes a person to age prematurely. And then so that was the first part one. In part two, which was the last episode, we talked about some simple nutritional strategies. We talked about insulin resistance. We talked about some hormones like DHEA. And growth hormone. We talked about rapamycin. We talked about melatonin. We talked about GLP-1s. And in this episode, we have another list of probably even more advanced strategies that you may be even less likely to have heard of. And so let's actually start with one which I first came across as a autoimmune strategy, but I know a lot of people are using it for anti-aging longevity as well, and that's low-dose naltrexone. So yeah, can you tell us about that, Dr. Miriam?
Yes, and I've also used LDN in my clinic primarily for patients with autoimmune conditions, but we know that just to kind of explain a bit, so naltrexone is a medication that temporarily blocks opioid receptors in the body. So it has primarily been used in drug overdose situations, but we've noticed that a dose that's much lower. So for example, rather than the 50 milligram dose, the lower dose we're using anywhere from 1.5 to 4.5 milligrams. And that's sort of the range of what I'm also using for longevity, from a longevity perspective. But at the low dose, it works by temporarily blocking the opioid receptors, and that leads to kind of a rebound increase in endorphin production, which can help to reduce inflammation, regulate the immune system. We then have found that that actually from a longevity perspective, it may actually enhance autophagy. So we talked about that in a previous episode, that's that process of clearing out damaged cells and promoting cellular rejuvenation. In addition to, we know that even just increasing endorphins can lead to stress reduction, improving metabolic health, and then there are other studies that link LDN to improved mitochondrial resilience.
Interesting. Okay, yeah, I didn't actually know about some of those angles. I think there's a connection with rapamycin, right, which we talked about in the previous episode, because rapamycin is so kind of immune system suppressive that in large doses it's used for people who've had an organ transplant. But I guess, it's stopping the immune system from being overactive and overly inflammatory. So that's something that they have in common, right?
Yes, I would say they are. They have that kind of cellular senescent link. I wouldn't, and I would say that I would use low-dose naltrexone for a specific type of person. Like if you're somebody who is struggling with high inflammatory markers, or perhaps there's a strong family history of autoimmune conditions, or if your genetics show that you might be prone to histamine intolerance, then maybe you'd be a good candidate, even if you are otherwise well, just from a longevity perspective.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I've done, I don't think I've done a whole episode on it, but I certainly talked about it before. And I do recommend, there's a website called, I think, LDN Network. And there's a couple of books about it as well, at least, where they talk about, categorize all the different things that it's potentially helpful for, and it is a vast list, and there is a lot of different doctors like yourself using it. So it's definitely something worth looking into. Is there any downside to it? Is there anyone who shouldn't be using it?
I would say that not really. I would say, as opposed to rapamycin, where potentially somebody that's that you wouldn't want too much of an immune suppression. This one seems to be more balancing. So I haven't found, for example, that patients on LDN are getting sort of more infections or anything like that. In terms of side effect profile, I do have a cohort of patients where they've just struggled to, it's affected their sleep patterns. And I used to think it was a bit psychosomatic. So I would say, oh, people tend to have vivid dreams when they take this at night, and you ideally should be taking it at night. And then but for majority of those people, if we moved it to the daytime, they could tolerate it. But there's been a select few where then they still seem to mess up their sleep cycle slightly. So in that case, definitely I wouldn't recommend continuing on it, because sleep is, of course, the ultimate longevity tool. But otherwise, it's been surprisingly well tolerated. And again, I've used it in the experience of patients with really severe mast cell activation syndrome, really kind of environmental sensitivity. So it's kind of, I would say, in terms of a side effect profile, it's actually been very well tolerated.
Very interesting. I remember the most interesting chapter of those books to me is probably it was like psychologist or psychiatrist using it. And because there's a bunch of different endorphins, right, which have fairly different effects and different endorphin receptors. So I think there was a theory that the more you are disassociative from a psychological perspective, that kind of uses up endorphins, and that depletes endorphins over time, to create that kind of dissociated fugue state that kind of requires endorphins. And so they would actually have people take LDN in the morning because it kind of stops them from disassociating. And so they would start to like have more authentic emotional responses to things, as opposed to just disassociating and shutting down. And I actually felt like, for me, as someone, I guess, who did go through a bunch of trauma throughout life, but certainly early life, that it did help with that. Like, it made me more present. So I think that's another interesting benefit. And there's constant talk about how good it is being present, right? Eckhart Tolle, all that kind of stuff. And so I don't know, maybe if that's an element to it as well. I'm a big fan of people like Alexander Lowen, who talk about how emotional repression is a key factor to what makes people ill. So I wonder if there's even an element about that, about how it kind of stops you from repressing emotions, and maybe that's another mechanism. It's hard to prove, but
yeah, I mean, it's a really good point, because I have used it. I used to be a medical director of a clinic where we were predominantly working with Walsh nutrient therapy and more from a mental health angle. And we were supposed to be using predominantly Walsh, but I would go a little bit off-piste if Walsh didn't seem to work. And LDN was something that it does have a lot of research to support, particularly depression. And it did seem to work actually quite well for... stereotyping here, but a lot of the younger male patients I was seeing who were very much very isolated and would be struggling to leave their rooms, that sorts of thing. I found the LDN actually quite effective and transformative, and even then getting them, like you said, more present to then engage in other therapies, I think was a big step.
interesting. I think that stereotype might be valid, because I think I remember reading that men have higher levels of endorphins on average than women. So maybe that gives some benefit of being a bit more emotionally less, I don't know, up and down, but also the drawback, as you said, of more likely to disassociate, more likely to withdraw, stuff like that the endorphins might actually support. So yeah, that's very interesting. Okay, well, that's awesome. We could probably do a whole episode on LDN, but let's go on to the next one on the list here. So this is a controversial one, and probably a lot of our viewers are not a fan, but it is being talked about, as a longevity strategy. So let's talk about it. What about mRNA gene therapy?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I think it's a fascinating field, and I know that, some of the positives of mRNA-based gene therapy for longevity have been, it's been supposedly, you could potentially reprogram old stem cells to to regain function, produce more like youthful proteins, which could then repair damage from aging, potentially enhancing mitochondrial biogenesis. So, I won't completely discount it, because I think that it's a fairly new area, and but I just see that particularly with people nowadays being more inflamed, more exposed to toxins, I just worry about how how the body's going to recognize that mRNA as something foreign, which could trigger more autoimmunity, more severe allergic reactions, more inflammation. And I just worry that if it's something that is kind of introduced, it would be very difficult to kind of stop that effect. So I would be very cautious. I would say that I think using it would have to be part of a more holistic program, where you're then really aggressively targeting inflammation and gut lining health, and and working on that autoimmunity. So I wouldn't jump for it. But saying that, modern medicine is, I'm always impressed to read the research on these sorts of things. So I might be proven wrong, but at the beginning, I wouldn't be jumping to experiment with it myself.
Yeah, like you and I are sometimes guinea pigs for new, nutritional things or whatever, but probably not for this. Actually, I genuinely hadn't thought about that. Maybe it's a sign of my ignorance, but like obviously, hypothetically, if you were to introduce mRNA to someone to get them to produce more of a toxin, then I could understand why that would create an autoimmune response. But just the fact that introducing an mRNA coding for anything, even a non-toxin, would still produce an autoimmune response actually isn't something that I'd considered. But it makes sense, because there's always the possibility, I think this is what you're saying, right? That even if the idea is to go in there and produce more of something beneficial that's totally natural, say, like there's no guarantee that it's going to work, and there's no guarantee that the body's not going to treat it as something to have an immune response to. Is that what you're basically saying?
Exactly. No, that's what I meant. And also, I think, as you said, even though the the compounds themselves might not necessarily be toxic, we also see that mRNA is often delivered in these nanoparticles, which could then accumulate in the liver or spleen. And we know that, again, because of just overall exposure, our detoxification organs are working on overdrive. That could also just compound those effects. So I think, I don't know, I'm not a huge fan. I'm happy to try peptides, exosomes, LDN, but that's something I probably would not want to try myself.
Fair enough. Okay, well, let's move on to another one, which I personally haven't tried, but I think it's pretty common these days, and it's PRP. I know that a lot of the time it's used for cosmetic purposes, but it's also used, I believe, for other anti-aging things, like, for instance, for joints and stuff. Is that right? And maybe there's more uses I'm not familiar with. So can you tell us about that? What is it? Why might someone consider it? And what do you think of it?
Yeah, so PRP, which is platelet-rich plasma therapy, is basically using your own blood. So you get a blood sample, spin it, centrifuge it, and then take the plasma bit, and then that is injected into various parts of your body. And that plasma then has a high concentration of growth factors and proteins that can help to promote tissue repair, reduce inflammation. I was also became familiar with PRP more from the cosmetic angle, particularly for hair loss, and just for more skin rejuvenation, hair rejuvenation. But as you mentioned, it is something that is also used for kind of in any place where stem cells could be stimulated and fibroblasts to regenerate tissues. So, so theoretically could be useful for repairing, not just repairing, but also just for pain relief and inflammation reduction in the joints and tendons, ligaments. Personally, I haven't really used that in my practice from a musculoskeletal point of view, but I have I've been sort of trained in using it for for alopecia and for hair regeneration and also for the face. And I think it's a pretty good tool. And would recommend it. And in terms of like autoimmunity or reactions to it, again, it is your own blood. So whilst there would still be a risk, because someone with autoimmunity then theoretically they're reacting to themselves, but generally it's lower risk than adding in an exogenous substance.
Makes sense. And as you brought it up, what about, we didn't have it on the list, but what about stem cells? Again, it's something I think I almost did, and then I'm not doing. It's one of those longevity strategies that you often hear celebrities talking about. I know Tony Robbins in his anti-aging book, it's one of his favorite things. Do you have experience with those? Do you ever use them?
I haven't had experience with it, like doing injections, but I have had several patients who they actually have found, like mesenchymal stem cell injections to be very useful for tissue repair from a musculoskeletal point of view. I've also had a couple of cases where, again, a bit controversial, and I wouldn't advocate for this, but for brain health and neuroinflammation, actually in younger, in children, for helping children who have sort of severe autism. I know there are some ethical concerns there, but I had sort of heard about this after the fact, and it seemed to have actually a very good effect on a child I was seeing, and sort of the parents had consulted me after they had done the mesenchymal stem cell injections for the child, and said that now it seemed like he was really improving to treatments that didn't work before, like gut microbiome work, a response to just improving detoxification pathways. It seemed to be like a kind of a new life for helping. So again, something where I'd probably have to do some extra training myself in, but I definitely could see the benefits.
What are the ethical implications? Is it the sourcing of the stem cells, or was there something else?
I mean, the sourcing of the stem cells, and I guess just, you'd hope parents are acting in their child's best interest, but sort of injections of substances that haven't undergone, too much. Maybe regulation is a long word. It's a little bit like you think you as yourself, if you're injecting yourselves with peptides, you kind of take the risk. But for a child, the legal implications are just a little bit. You'd want stronger evidence, I think, to actually engage using that.
Okay, all right, that makes sense. Let's move to another one that I think you have a bit more experience with. Is that exosomes? Do you have experience with those?
So I've, exosomes again is something I've studied. I don't use them in my clinic, but it's all. I would say a lot of these work on quite similar pathways as some of these other therapies. But we, with exosomes, we're taking kind of what we think of as these tiny extracellular vesicles that we're extracting from stem cells that do contain growth factors and repair signals, and these themselves are also stimulating tissue regeneration. Again, I've used them more in the aesthetic setting, so in terms of stimulating collagen production and speeding up wound healing and improving skin elasticity, and again, I think in combination, some people are using PRP plus exosomes for skin health and hair regrowth.
And sorry, what are exosomes? Maybe we should also include that.
So exosomes are just these tiny extracellular kind of vesicles that are derived from from stem cells. So basically, it's like you're taking a little bit of the stem cell there, and those. So in a way, it's supposed to be a little bit more targeted than taking the whole stem cell, but it's still I would say quite a new area. We worry a little bit that because of how rapidly stem cells divide, and taking kind of a potent ingredient from that could lead to uncontrolled growth. And but generally the exosomes themselves and the stem cells tend to be from embryonic sources, and so there's a little bit of controversy about kind of the sourcing of them.
I understand that. Yeah, I thought with stem cells they can often get it from umbilical cords or placenta these days. Is that not right?
Theoretically, yes, but because again the industry isn't so regulated, you just don't really know where they're coming from. Which I would say with skin, it's such a kind of rapidly regenerating organ that I would think that's a little bit lower risk, but I would be a little bit more wary about injecting it kind of in other parts of the body. But it might just be because I'm not using it for other things.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay. Okay, and I think actually before we move on, so those three, I haven't done any of those. For the average longevity enthusiast, who's probably maybe the average person watching this with rapt attention, are any of those worth considering if you have a medium to limited budget, or are they all kind of a bit only for those who really have a lot of money?
I mean, for those, I have seen really good effects for PRP, particularly for hair, for hair, for kind of stimulating the hair and having
something.
thicker hair.
Yeah. Okay.
So if that's something that is near and dear to you and you're worried about your hair thinning, I would advocate it because I've seen quite good results even with 1 or 2 sessions. So and I would say this.
Is it like when someone's lost as much as me, or is that more you got to catch it early?
I would say in general you have to catch it early. It's more when you've noticed like thinning hair or kind of like a receding hairline, and you're probably not going to regenerate areas that are completely bald, but just on the hairline. But I've been really pleasantly surprised, particularly like post-viral hair loss. So people, for example, who they really saw a thinning in their hair after COVID. This is one I've personally tried because I definitely had a period where I think it was post-viral that my hair was really thinning, and I have a lot of hair, so it was a little bit of a vanity thing. And I tried it and definitely saw a difference. And then it was, more objectively, like hairdressers saw a difference and they could notice like a lot of baby hair growth. So, I was sold from an N of 1, but then I also saw it in my own patients who were using it.
Nice, great. Well, I've never cared about my hair. It's always been an annoyance to me, as I said in previous episodes. I was quite happy when I had the excuse to shave it all off, although I'm quite lazy with that, even only get around to it every couple of weeks. But I know a lot of people very much care about their hair. So if you do, there you go. PRP is something to consider if you feel like you're starting to lose it. Okay, so next we've got a couple more kind of broad things here. So we have, senolytic cell detox. So we've really touched on this in the previous episode, but let's explain to people again what senolytic cells are and why you might want to detoxify them.
Yes, so again, senescent cells are what we call these zombie cells that stop dividing, but then they don't actively die. So and we think that these cells sort of hanging around the body can cause chronic inflammation and tissue damage, and that can accelerate aging. And then so senolytics are compounds that then can destroy these senescent cells and thereby reducing inflammation, boosting tissue regeneration, enhancing mitochondrial function.
Okay, so can you give us an example of some senolytics and maybe the most common and also your favorites?
Yeah, so the kind of more, I would say, natural senolytics have been things like quercetin, EGCG, curcumin. Those have been sort of more the supplemental versions. And it's interesting because I used to always skip talking about EGCG, but recently, Elwin, we've been talking about EGCG and helping with removing copper from the body. And actually, I have noticed.
I think, iron and heavy metals is specifically what the focus is. But you're right, it does also remove copper. There's research on that, yeah.
So I'm sort of rediscovering its use as a senolytic just because of helping with eliminate, because we think copper and iron are inflammatory to the body, so theoretically it should help. So I really, that's one I really like. And I am also a fan of quercetin for reducing inflammation, particularly those who have more of this like mast cell type predilection with sinus issues. And I know that there are now some pharmaceutical senolytics where they've taken combinations of like quercetin and dasatinib. Frankly, I would probably just take the supplement, but it may just be worth knowing about combinations like that. There's another one, I think Quercetin as well, which is another kind of pharmaceutical senolytic that's also derived from foods, really.
Is that pharmaceutical? I didn't know that. I've seen that in a bunch of supplements. I think I even had a liposomal. I thought it was pronounced Quercetin, honestly, but I'm sure you know better than me.
No, it's not when I use that comma, so you may be right there.
Okay.
But because I think they actually do derive it from strawberries, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. It's a polyphenol something. I thought,
but it is. I believe that it may have in some countries actually been developed as a pharmaceutical. Again,
there's a bunch of them like that, right? Like benfotiamine or solbutamine, things like that. Yeah, okay, it's one of those. Fair enough. And just to go back to quercetin, I see these days people offering dehydroquercetin. Is there any value in that as opposed to normal quercetin?
I would say, to be honest, so I know that the quercetin that I frequently use in practice is like quercetin dihydrate, but I didn't know.
Maybe that's what I'm thinking of. Sorry.
Which is supposed to be a bit more of a bioavailable form. But the thing with quercetin is actually it's not a very well absorbed supplement in general. So actually, like taking higher doses of it isn't necessarily so effective. It's actually better to take it with vitamin C, and that can apparently improve its absorption.
And all the ones you've just mentioned there, Quercetin, ECCG, quercetin. I know there are a cohort of our viewers, maybe from the carnivore world, maybe from another world, who consider them all like poisons to various degrees. Like the idea of polyphenol, right? Phenol is a poison, so just because it's poly doesn't mean it's no longer a poison. So, but of course, when we're talking about senolytic, we're talking about something that destroys cells, right? So, first of all, I guess, do you agree that it's any kind of do you think it's not a poison? Do you think it's a poison? Do you think it's a poison, but it like selectively poisons things you want to have poison, like senescent cells? Where do you land on the spectrum there?
More the latter. I mean, it's interesting. I'm not a big fan of the carnivore diet for extended periods of time. I think it can be incredibly useful for those who have this very imbalanced immune response where they're just reacting to everything. And so, but I think that if that's the case, you can use the carnivore diet, but then you actively need to be working on gut health. And I think eventually adding in certain prebiotics. And I've still found the quercetin to be relatively well tolerated in that cohort, because I've usually introduced quercetin before I've tried to diversify that person's diet. But
I think the objection to all these compounds, including ones that I recommend, is that yes, they work, but they work by suppressing detoxification. So actually they make you worse overall. Is that an objection that you can address?
I can address. I mean, just that I haven't found that in clinical practice. I generally see like improvements in inflammatory markers, improvements in antibody counts using these sorts of compounds. But I mean, theoretically, as you said, they are working to kill off senescent cells. So yes, there is some killing action there, but I would say it's a beneficial one.
I'm more on the latter as well. I think it's case by case. But yeah, I was interested in your take on it. Okay, that's awesome. And we're going to do a full episode on peptides, I think, soon. But just as we're on the subject of senolytics, is there any senolytic peptides that you want to shout out?
I was going to say actually, well, let me have a think. So, I use things like epitalon in practice, which is supposed to be, supposed to help activate telomerase and, an enzyme responsible for maintaining telomere length. And
Is that a senolytic?
well, it's kind of in that category.
Is it?
I mean,
Okay, I didn't
I
realize.
would, I guess I think of the classic when I think maybe not necessarily a senolytic, but just an anti-aging type of peptide.
Well, let's talk about those next, because I think next on our list we've got like mitochondrial optimization. So epitella might be more in that category, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So let's bridge onto that one then. So yeah, sorry if you want to carry on with any peptides, and then we'll talk about mitochondrial next.
Yeah, because I was going to say, I mean, apart from epitalon, I was thinking more. I mean, there are. I'm kind of struggling to think of like a specific one that I would call senolytic. Is there
Well, I
one
think
that?
isn't there SS31? I think that might be one of them. Humanin. Yeah, I don't know. They're quite obscure. I just thought you might. If you don't have an experience with them, fair enough.
Yeah.
Let's move on to mitochondrial optimization.
Peptide world, I would say, is so vast, and again, that's sort of one where we'll talk about this in a future episode, but I try and stick to, I mean, maybe around like 2030 that I think more people are taking in general, so at least have a bit more data of which ones are helping. But SS31, you're right, it could influence cellular senescence, but it's not one that I use that much of, to be honest.
No, fair enough. I think 20 to 30, I think the most I've ever talked about in the YouTube channel is 15. So I think there'll still be plenty that we haven't talked about in this channel. So I look forward to that episode. Stay tuned for that one. For now, all right. So mitochondrial, you hear this all the time. Mitochondrial health, mitochondrial dysfunction, metabolic disease, mitochondrial optimization. There's more and more talk basically about how mitochondrial function or lack of might be the root cause of all kinds of diseases, all kinds of things that prevent longevity, and then mitochondrial optimization may be the key to longevity. There's a lot of there's a school of thought that we've so far have paid much too much attention to nuclear DNA in relation to mitochondrial DNA. So tell us what your take is on that in general, and then maybe we'll get into practicalities.
Sure. So I've explored mitochondrial health more so in the realm of chronic fatigue, problems with exercise endurance, because we know, of course, that mitochondria is where your ATP is produced, so your primary kind of energy currency of the cell. And we know that because of that, then the mitochondria influence so many things, and how especially your metabolism, how you're utilizing nutrients and producing energy, and I've become more interested in that, just doing more mitochondrial testing, where we're looking at how efficiently the mitochondria is using oxygen to make ATP, how efficiently they're working to maintain your intracellular calcium levels, which is also very crucial for quite a few signaling pathways, and many other things. And so, and I think.
And sorry, Dr. Miriam, I wasn't planning to do this. We didn't rehearse this or anything, but maybe we should actually share my mitochondrial test results. And would that be okay? And you can explain to people just the basics. I know that they're quite complex. We don't have to go through the whole thing, because this is one of the things I think, we put an episode out recently where I shared my test results, and we said how healthy is Elwin? And the answer was, quite by almost every test. I'm pretty healthy. And there's a few things we talked about where I have a better result than you've ever seen. But a glaring exception to that has been when we did my mitochondrial test results, right? Where they really were not very good. I'm just trying to find them now. And I think you said, this is pretty common, right? That you rarely see anyone's test results where their mitochondria do look healthy, but still, That may not be saying much because it may just be that it's true that generally there's a lot of people with unhealthy mitochondria, right? So I'm just trying to find these test results.
Yeah, I think it'd be very useful to see, because I agree with you, and I've always wondered slightly, like with, for example, things like nutri-vals, where you're supposed to be measuring mitochondrial health or nutrient status, that you can kind of, I wouldn't say artificially get your health to look good on the nutri-val, but I've always wondered, like, some people then they supplement with everything they're low in. The test looks great, but they still don't feel great. But I would say that the mitochondrial test that I run is from a German lab, and I really only run it in people who are struggling. It isn't a test I do just for prevention purposes. Maybe I should, but and often those people who've been struggling with chronic fatigue, brain fog, they're almost happy to see that the results are so bad, because they're like, oh, this is how I feel, like very low in energy, struggling to get out of bed, can't have an exercise regimen. So it has been surprisingly accurate from that regard.
Yeah, and I'm not someone who's struggling to get out of bed, but I'm definitely someone who is not at the level that I want to be. And, we blame this on lead more than anything, because that was the one thing that we could identify that was a definite, that's not how it should be. It should be a lot better, it should be a lot lower than that. And of course, there are potentially other things as well. But it was interesting to see that, and I'm always happy to find room for improvement. I'm never upset if there's a negative test. Even if I felt great and I got this test result, I would be kind of, oh, well, that's good, because it means there's so much room for improvement. I could feel so much better. Because a lot of the time we think we feel good, but actually, we have no idea how much better we could feel.
Genetic Insights provides cutting-edge, affordable DNA testing, giving you access to over 500 health reports that can help you in 3 key ways. They may be able to resolve your existing health challenges even when nothing else has worked. Using simple lifestyle changes, their reports can help you reduce your risk of developing future health challenges that you may be genetically predisposed to. And they can help you feel more confident in your health by showing you where you are genetically strong. Unlike most other genetic health testing companies, Genetic Insights tests over 83 million different variations in your genes, guaranteeing 99.7% accuracy across all of their DNA reports. They cover almost every aspect of health, including digestive issues, cardiovascular health, weight loss, hormonal and blood sugar balance, as well as nutrient needs, allergies and intolerances, and so much more. Using their system is quick and easy, and reading the reports is simple. If you've done an Ancestry DNA test, you can simply download your raw DNA data, upload it to the Genetic Insights platform, and within a few hours you will have access to genetic reports which give you a risk score for each specific issue, and scientifically validated recommendations based on your individual genetic profile. Everything in your reports are based on scientific studies, and there are citation links throughout every report. If you are serious about optimizing your health and wellness and feeling great, then getting access to your Genetic Insights reports may be the most important health investment you will ever make. In the reports, not only will you gain insights into how to overcome existing health challenges and avoid future issues, you'll also discover which types of dietary, lifestyle, and even supplement protocols are best for your unique genetics. To get your unique genetic health reports, go to geneticinsights.co and use code Rejuvenate to get 20% off today. That's geneticinsights.co using coupon code Rejuvenate to get 20% off today.
Yeah, so we can see, these are your, this is your mitochondrial test, and, we can see that there's quite a few things in the red there, that your glycolytic ATP capacity, so that start of cellular respiration, looked pretty poor. Your reserve capacity actually looked pretty decent, and your total ATP production was also kind of borderline. Yeah, and
you say pretty decent, but it's still on this
as in it wasn't in the red, I guess, compared to things that were in the red. Is what I'm trying to say.
And you say for most people whose results you see, they're almost always mostly in the red. But then again, usually you do this for people with chronic fatigue, so that would make sense, right?
Yeah, where your results, like I said, were a little bit different was that you seemed to be more efficient when you were using oxygenation for aerobic respiration, and we were a little bit perplexed by that, why you would have sort of there would be poor glycolysis at the start. So that should be the process that requires less oxygen but is less efficient at producing ATP, and it would lead to like lactic acid generation. But then you seem to do better in when you had sort of when you were using oxygen to then have a more efficient way of producing lots of ATP.
Yep. And actually don't have lactic acid buildup, not only in the like urine test, but also when I've done blood lactate before, and there's not, it's low. So it's weird, isn't it?
Yeah, but we were discussing this actually with the person who runs the lab, and actually we believe that because of your quite low carbohydrate diet and a higher fat diet, that actually could have been one of the reasons why glycolysis wasn't so efficient, and you were able to then produce ATP through kind of an alternative pathway, and that's why the aerobic respiration was better.
So this is this Randall effect, right? That your body tends to get good at either burning carb as a fuel or fat, but not great at both. Yeah, so I was maybe better at beta oxidation. We think that's probably true because I do have a large amount of fat. Like a lot of my calories come from fat. I'm not keto, but it's definitely skews that way. I don't seem to have any problem digesting the fat, whatever. So it must be being burnt into a fuel. Let's just show the other one as well. Let's see if there's anything interesting there. And again, so why are we showing this? Just probably because you've never seen it before, right? This is extremely unusual that anyone does these tests. So that's one reason. And then also, so, for the people who are very focused on longevity, as you said, this, typically you've done it for chronic fatigue, but someone with a good budget who wants to do all the tests they can for longevity, this is definitely one worth considering, right?
Especially because, we often see the other way around where people seem to have poor oxygenation, and then that can, if that's poor, we can work on strategies to help improve oxygenation, which can include things like using methylene blue or CO2 therapy, and it could tailor sort of which treatments to optimize your health.
Yes. Yeah, that makes sense. Let's explain what a couple of these mean for people. So Mitochondrial Health Index, that's basically just like a summation of everything. Is that right?
Exactly. So that's a summation of everything.
Okay. So with that, I'm bad, stroke not great, because we want it to be over 2.5. What about coupling efficiency? What does that mean?
So coupling efficiency basically refers to how effectively the energy that's produced through cellular respiration is used to generate ATP. So, for example, which basically means how effective the mitochondria are at making ATP is like a simpler way to put that. But the
so if mine is almost, perfect or in the target range, why is that score so much lower? Where's the disparity?
So, basically it means that if somebody has a low coupling efficiency, it means that a large portion of the energy is lost as heat rather than being used as ATP production. And that can be a sign of mitochondrial dysfunction, that there's a reduced efficiency of oxidative phosphorylation.
Now, the repeat kind of followers are always obsessed with trying to decouple because they're trying to increase their body temperatures and their heat, right? So is that a bad idea then from your point of view or this point of view?
That's a good point. I mean, I guess that... sorry. Yeah, no, go ahead, sorry.
To ask it a different way, like if my coupling efficiency is high, does that mean my decoupling is low, or are they, is it like you could be bad at both, you could be good at both, you could, like, do you know what I mean? Like, are they antagonistic to each other, or can you be good at coupling and good at decoupling? Like,
I think you can be good at both, because generally you want high coupling, you want most of the energy to be used for ATP synthesis, and you don't want the energy to be lost as heat. That basically just, because that heat doesn't sort of help your body process, it just sort of is lost. So I think it's likely that you are you're good at coupling and decoupling. I think that's how I've understood it.
Okay. And so this one, reserve respiration capacity. Do you know what that one means?
So reserve respiration capacity, it basically is a, I mean, I would say that it's basically how the mitochondria are able to gauge how much oxygen needs to be consumed to create ATP, and how much how much reserve they have to be able to respond to stress, to any situation where more energy is required.
Okay, so like emergency reserve, almost like a Jing from a Chinese medicine point of view.
Exactly, and you know that's a marker that I frequently see as being low, and you kind of can even recognize that, where a lot of people are like, I'm okay if I can function in this like very small bubble, but as soon as I'm stressed, I get fatigued or brain fog, and so it's something where, it's one of the more important markers on this test.
Okay, all right. So this one, cellular oxygen consumption profile. So maybe we can talk about all these together. Non-mitochondrial respiration, a share of total respiration. So it's saying like 40% of respiration is going on non-mitochondrial respiration, and you really want it to be below 10. So that's much higher than it should be. And then this one, share of respiration used for mitochondria, I guess that's just the opposite, right? So that's 53, and you want it to be above 90. So those are kind of opposite, in parallel to each other. So I guess what they're saying is there's a lot of non-mitochondrial respiration going on for me. What does that mean? Is that common? What do you do about it? Sorry, not what you do about it. We'll do what you do about it next once we've gone for the test. What causes it? I guess that would be a better question.
So generally it means that a lot of that respiration is being, a lot of that energy production is being lost to something else. So it usually means that there's some external factors that is using up your energy. So that could be responding to pathogens, to toxins. That's what I generally see. So if I see your profile there, I would want to do some further testing to see what could be using up some of that energy that's lost.
Okay. And in our case, we thought maybe lead is the most obvious thing for that, but you would test all kinds of toxins like that, all kinds of infectious agents potentially. Okay.
Exactly.
Great. And this one, and that could explain why, even though I'm fairly good at making energy, the health index is still not very high because a lot of it's being lost. Is that kind of
Exactly.
what we're...
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. And then the ATP turnover rate, ATP reserve, potential maximum oxygen consumption rate. Is there any of these that are worth focusing on?
I mean, it's basically still sort of showing that, your reserve is pretty low. So we'd want to improve that production of ATP. It's kind of reiterating some of the same things that we saw before, but also that you're not consuming enough oxygen, and potentially, but it's a tough one in your case, because I wonder if for you it's maybe not necessarily a circulation issue, but it maybe those nutritional pathways are affected as well by a stronger high-fat diet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Have you done this test on many people? Because what confused me about this is, I think when we first did this test, you were saying that, and then I was looking at other people who do this test, and I found like a doctor who worked with chronic fatigue people who recommends this test, who recommends a strict ketogenic diet to people. So I'm like, are they seeing these numbers improve when people are on a strict ketogenic diet then? Like this glycolysis thing? It seems like counterintuitive from not just you, but what this lady who works at this company was saying.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't found the ketogenic diet to particularly improve the markers, but I have to say that when
Do you find it makes it worse?
Again, there's so many factors. I definitely think that you then have to look at fat absorption and the gut microbiome, as well as so it's a tough one. I would say that this test gives us so many markers. I wouldn't say that every one of them is useful, but it does give us a lot of information. And I know that even though I have run this test quite frequently, it's more I like to sort of look at it and see, okay, like there is an issue with mitochondria and we need to improve that. And either it's working on it it's working on sort of some potentially genetic factors of why the mitochondria might not be working so well, or external factors. And this sort of helps us to tailor whether we need to work more on oxygenation, reducing inflammation. So I found it useful from that perspective. But some of them, the markers, I don't find, I think they add to the story or to the theory, but aren't crucial.
Well, let's talk about that then. So let's talk about, so you just use a couple of examples. So what are the things that can go wrong then? You just gave a couple. Is there like, do you have a list of the things that can go wrong and how you would deal with each one? Do you want to go through that? And I realize it's case by case, but, just very broad.
Broad. So, I found, so I think there is a genetic component to it. And we know that,
Yes, sorry, I was going to bring that up. Yeah. Because for instance, so the mitochondria is inherited from the mother only, right?
Exactly.
That's an important distinction. So my mother had, cancer several times, which is very much related to mitochondrial dysfunction. I think she had fatigue as well. So I'm pretty sure I did not inherit some very good mitochondria from her. So how much impact does that have, and what can be done about that?
So, I mean, I think that,
anything.
no, I think there's generally genetics and there's epigenetics. So certainly you can always influence how efficiently, you can always add in cofactors that help certain mitochondrial processes work faster or inhibit others. But, we know that then if you did have that genetic mutation, you'd be at increased risk. So you'd want to be taking more of those cofactors.
So what are those cofactors? Let's get into it.
So, things like, I like to use higher doses of CoQ10, NAD, and also just more.
So NAD, there's no such thing as NAD, right? It's either nicotinamide riboside, NMN. So what do you like to do?
Because I really like to use, not just NAD on its own.
But there is no such thing as NAD, right? There's still the question. It's either NR or NMN or nicotinic acid or niacinamide.
Nicotinamide would be sort of what I would be using in a supplemental form, as kind of a raw material that we use to make NAD. But then I'd like to also use actually things like alpha lipoic acid, quercetin. We also particularly ones that are derived from Sephora japonica, a plant, which that tree has just a lot of powerful flavonoids, and we think.
Is that the one that resveratrol usually comes from, or? No?
Not from my knowledge.
Sorry, is there another name for it, I guess, that I'm familiar with? It rings a bell.
Sephora japonica. I know that apart from quercetin, you get rutin from it as well. So It's kind of like there are a few flavonoids that are found in that tree. But we know that like flavonoids plus the nicotinamide can really activate that NAD pathway. That would be kind of another. That would be another sort of way to kind of improve your mitochondrial, to just kind of improve that cycle of ATP production.
Okay. What other cofactors do you have in mind? Literally for energy production, there's like magnesium, there's a lot of the B vitamins, right? B1, B5, B7. Do you use any of those? I'm just thinking, what about bog standard cofactors?
It's a tough one because I don't really. I like to look at somebody's Nutrival and then figure out what they could be low in, but I generally find that most often I see sort of vitamins B5 as well, pantothenic acid. Magnesium as well, being quite low, and so those would be two that I would also consider replacing if it comes back low on a test. But I wouldn't on like something like a Nutrival. There's so many things you could theoretically be taking to improve it that I think that in order to prevent you from taking 100 things, it's just better to focus on the ones that you actually need.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so you don't just throw every nutrient you might need, you test to see what nutrients are low. Totally makes sense, yeah. Okay, so that's one. You also said inflammation would be another kind of key thing that you'd focus on. Like, so sorry, just to go back to what we said. So you said based on that mitochondrial test, you could see there could be different problems that you can identify and then treat. So one of them you said could be a lack of cofactors. You said inflammation is the next one. Is that right?
Yeah, I was going to say more like there are environmental factors that can damage the mitochondria, and that's where we get into like heavy metals, pesticides, viruses, and so.
Well, let's talk about those.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot about heavy metals, so we can certainly, well, we will do that today, but let's focus on the other two first. So pesticides, is that something you test for?
I do. So there are certain environmental panels, like well, it used to be called Great Plains Lab, but now Mosaic Medical. They do a tox panel that has that looks for phthalates and sort of exhaust type environmental pollutants, glyphosates. You can test for all of those now. Typically urine tests.
My understanding is if you reduce exposure that they get cleared out of the system pretty quickly. Is that correct or incorrect in your experience? Like so when I say pretty quickly, I guess compared to something like heavy metals or mycotoxins, it can take years.
It's quite interesting because I don't find that, but then again, I think it all really depends on your detoxification pathways. But I found particularly some of my patients who've grown up in very polluted areas and now have lived in like the countryside. Well, lived in the countryside for 20 years, still are chock full of environmental pollutants. I guess you could argue that there could be pesticides in farming and things like that.
Countryside is more full of pesticides in my experience. Well, it depends where you are, right? In England, like there's not a square foot of England that isn't covered in pesticides in my experience, but it depends where you are. Okay, so fair enough. So yeah, and of course, what I just said, I think that was based on studies where it seems to clear out the body pretty quickly, but I mean, they can be misleading, of course. It may be building up in tissues, and that's not as easy to see with a test. Okay, but in your experience, it can take a while, especially if someone's struggling to detoxify in general, right?
Yeah, I guess to that point, now you're right in the sense that like I typically don't use chelators for pesticides or for environmental pollutants, whereas I do with metals.
Okay.
So
what do you do with pesticides? Sorry, before we go into metals.
I mean, pesticides, I do more sort of supporting the liver detox pathways, the kidneys, and then also I do use certain binders, occasionally things like cholestyramine as well, so bile acid binders, but then things like activated charcoal, zeolites, and then things like sauna or infrared sauna. But again, a lot of those patients are quite sensitive, so you have to do it for a longer period of time and in short bursts.
Let's talk about cholestyramine for a second, because I know a lot of our followers are into detox, but they haven't tried it, or maybe they even have a negative view of it. So I think the main cause of it is just that it's artificial. That would be their view. Why use something artificial when you can use, something like activated charcoal, which is natural? And then secondarily, the other objection, I guess, is, it requires a prescription, it's more expensive. So like now, obviously we're talking about advanced longevity strategies. So, but even if someone is advanced, even if someone, they can afford it and they're happy to do whatever's best, like why is cholestyramine, worth going to the extra trouble for, in your experience?
I mean, I think the fact that it's just so specific as a bile acid binder and how we eliminate not just environmental pollutant type toxins, but also things like mycotoxins. A lot of that does require a healthy liver, gallbladder, bile duct, and that is an area where typically we find a lot of pathology in today's society. So in a way, it's really helping with that access that often doesn't work very well for many people.
But like compared to charcoal, which was supposed to do something pretty similar, like why would you prefer the cholestyramine?
I've just had, I guess, clinically, I've found some people can tolerate cholestyramine a bit better, whereas some people with I mean, there is a theory as well that it just is better able to eliminate more. But some people some of my patients just have had reactions to charcoal, and they seem to tolerate cholestyramine. Also, they may have fat malabsorption issues, and actually that bile, that cholestyramine can also help with that. So it can help both with the eliminating toxins, but also help with absorption of fats and also fat soluble vitamins. So it has just some extra added benefits.
Okay. Okay, great. And anything else on the subject of generally supporting detoxification that you want to recommend?
Yeah,
that you're
I'll
a
just
fan of?
I'll just make another point though about the cholestyramine, because I think one of the issues with it is that you can get it as a medication, but that medication tends to have like artificial sweeteners and some additives, and it is a little bit more difficult to get compounded cholestyramine where you just have the powder, and you typically have to find a compounding pharmacy that will supply that. So I would use charcoal over cholestyramine. People where we just can't access we can only access the pharmaceutical one.
Yeah, fair enough. I agree with that. Yeah, but I also agree. I prefer the cholestyramine personally to the charcoal. But I just wanted. I think most people who are, if they're using any binder, they're probably not using cholestyramine who are watching. So I wanted to ask you about it. Okay, that's great. Again, anything you want to add about generally supporting detox, or do you want to move on to heavy metals?
I mean, I'm also a fan of, well, on the sort of case for saunas, and not just sauna, but if you are somebody who can exercise, just trying to activate sweating, I think is very important as a phase 1 detox mechanism. And because I think people always assume like detox has to be this big sort of expensive like package thing that people sign up to, but it's just even simple practices like sweating out toxins. And we know even from a heavy metals perspective that there are some toxins, that certain metals that don't react very well to chelators, and really all you can do is sweat and use certain binders. So
Yep. I saw a study on that recently that in sweat there was like double of most of the heavy metals per milliliter compared to urine. So it's actually more effective than going through. And then it saves the kidneys and the bladder having to deal with them, because it goes straight from the lymph and it's pushed out through the skin. So I 100% agree with that. And I also 100% want to emphasize the exercise thing. I think you don't even have to sweat. Even if the difference between being sedentary versus walking an hour a day and not pushing yourself hard enough to sweat, in terms of how much it would move lymph and help to detoxify, even that makes a difference. So even if you don't some people don't like to sweat, I've noticed, especially women when they're exercising. But any movement is going to be good for detox, right? Better than not moving.
Exactly. And I would also just say keeping your liver and kidney healthy. I see quite a lot of abnormal renal markers nowadays in younger people. And
let's talk about that then. So what can you do to keep your kidney healthy? Oh, and sorry to interrupt you. Why do you think you're seeing more abnormal renal markers?
Well, I used to think it was because actually people were overdosing on protein, and it was just too much for the kidney to handle. I think that still might be the case. People who used to be having like 4 grams per kilogram, I just think it's too much. I
didn't know people were doing that. Well, I mean, maybe bodybuilders or something. Is that common?
Yeah, I'd say more that cohort of people, but bodybuilders, I mean, you have a lot of males who are trying to emulate that. I feel like, where it's just lunch is an entire chicken, and then whey protein shake after whey protein shakes. But I think I would say probably too much dirty protein, as I would say, like non-organic, a lot of toxins added, and I think just the combination of that is really having a toxic effect on the kidneys. So that's one reason. And then I just think generally more toxins in our food, in our air, is just overloading, and people forget that the kidney is as important of a detox organ as the liver.
Okay. Yeah, my understanding is that I know that they both constantly detoxify, but that once the liver is overloaded, the kidneys are kind of a backup system. But the difference is the liver is more regenerative, whereas the kidneys aren't, right? So that might be where you see the kidney markers go up before the liver markers. Actually, the liver might be the problem first, but the liver is kind of very good at regenerating itself. So it often takes a while before you see liver markers. But then once the liver's overloaded, the kidneys become overwhelmed, and then the kidney markers do change quite quickly. Is that a reasonable theory?
Yeah, I mean that's my understanding too. But you'll notice actually even in the supplement world, there's now a lot more targeted things, particularly for kidney health. And there are certain herbs, like for example, dandelion, are supposed to be equally good for the liver and the kidney, but there are others that seem to have at least some evidence to support that they could improve kidney filtration markers.
Well, let's talk about that. So, yeah, I mean, the typical kidney herbs are all I've really heard. It's always dandelion, nettle, burdock, juniper, that kind of thing, like corn silk, those kind of formulas, goldenrod, that's uva ursi. Those kind of formulas are what you see when you look at 95% of supplements anyway in the kidney space. So people have probably really heard of those or tried those. What's your opinion on those? And then also, what I'm interested in is what else is out there. Is there any other option?
I'd like to use Quicksilver Scientific products for metals detox, and they have a specific blend for kidney health that has astragalus, but like the active ingredient of astragallus, so I think
Astragaloside 4, yeah.
Yeah, astragaloside 4. And ferulic acid as well, as those two in combination. And then I think there's an herbal blend there as well that has dandelion, goldenrod, poria or fuling, hashuwu.
Some
Maybe
of the
a few
Chinese
more.
ones, yeah, Romania, that kind of thing. Okay.
I would say the TCM focuses a lot more on the kidneys and how, I think they have, they've always seemed to focus on the kidneys more than we have. I feel like in the West we're sort of like ignoring the kidneys, and even when you go to conventional GP, it's like when your markers are out of range, you're often just told, oh, you must be dehydrated, and then we'll recheck, and then often they don't recheck. So it's just don't ignore it if it comes up. Don't just assume it's because you're dehydrated, I would say. There is also some evidence of using specific amino acids like leucine and glycine for kidney health. At the top of my head, I'm blanking as to why exactly for kidney health, but it was in kind of a lecture about particular amino acids too, for that, that are crucial for the kidney, because of course when someone does have kidney damage, you're taught to limit the amount of protein you're eating. But there is actually, I would say, just on that note, you'll hear things like if you are somebody with compromised kidney function, you should be having less than like 30 grams of protein a day. But a pretty low amount, but there is some evidence to support that actually plant-based proteins don't have that same negative effect. So you can actually increase your protein count using plant-based sources of protein, which might be a bit controversial, I guess, for your viewers, but that's, at least from a kidney health perspective, something that I've seen.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. I think I've seen that as well. And back to what you said a few minutes ago, you said like 4 grams of protein per kilo is excessive. So for the person watching this, maybe they think the kidneys are a bit suboptimal, but it hasn't, it's not a disease or anything, hasn't been picked up. What is the upper level of protein that you think is safe or fine, let's say, for the kidneys?
I mean, I probably wouldn't be going more than like 1.5 grams per kilo, which may seem a bit low, but and I guess on top of that, I'd be trying to figure out why are the kidneys not working to optimal capacity, and heavy metals could be a big part of that. So it may not just be that your kidneys are shutting down only because of the excess protein and troubles detoxing it.
Yeah, I have to say I am more on the side of the toxins theory than the excess protein theory, because I think there are certain people in the past who would have eaten a very heavily protein diet and not had an issue, going back thousands, tens of thousands of years or whatever. So I think the toxins thing definitely resonates with me more. So okay, let's talk about heavy metals, right? I've done a whole episode on this, so I'd recommend people check that out if they want a thorough guide, but this is like Dr. Miriam's strategy, and if this is a big deal, there are some people, I'm not 100% convinced they're wrong, that think that heavy metals are the primary cause of all aging, not even just premature aging. That they're a very big deal. And in that category, we could include things like, as you mentioned earlier, iron and copper, which are technically in that category, though they're also nutritional metals. There are, schools of thought that believe copper toxicity is the number one thing. There are schools of thought that believe that iron toxicity is the number one thing. You've been trained in systems that believe heavy metal toxins are at least a big deal, right? So what is your take on this? How important are they? How much of a priority should testing and treating them be? What do you see most commonly? I guess, yeah, tell us the whole...
Yeah. Can I just add one more point about the proteins? So far, and I promise I'll go into this. But just to add, I think one of the big issues are some people really struggle to break down proteins from food, and so in terms of like for somebody that might have reduced kidney function, who we're trying to limit their protein intake to 1.5 grams per kilo, I wouldn't count things like gelatin or pre-digested proteins where you're really just getting the amino acids. It seems like that's better tolerated, and so I just wonder if maybe it could again be a digestibility issue, and once you have those larger fragments, the kidneys are struggling. So maybe just something to take into account.
That's a good distinction. Okay,
Yeah.
so but what does that mean? Even people using lots of whey protein isolate or whatever, that's fine?
No, I mean, well, I would say
No,
more.
so it's really got to be it's got to be hydrolyzed down to individual amino acids.
Exactly, hydrolyzed forms, yeah.
Okay.
But
All
then,
right, let's get to heavy metals then.
Heavy metals. No, I definitely think it's a major source of aging and age-related, a major contributor to aging and age-related diseases. I guess we don't. The trouble is, of course, we are living longer, and I guess you could have said
Are
that.
we in the last 50 or 100 years?
Well, more so than if we look at the life expectancy 100 years ago. I would say that's increased.
But if you remove infant mortality, is the average person who lives beyond the age of 2 actually gone up in the last 100 years?
Well, I guess, okay.
My understanding is that the answer is no,
Oh, really? Okay. I mean,
Yeah.
I think, well, I have to say at post, maybe in the last few years, you are seeing a lot more mortality in kind of people in their 50s than you were previously. But I would say that I think overall the age, but no, I'd have to look a bit more into that. But I would say
I'll look it up right now while you carry on.
But definitely we know that, exposure to, that heavy metals tend to accumulate in your body over time, and then they get stored in bones, organs, and then kind of sit there and contribute to oxidative stress, which then damages cellular components such as your mitochondria, and that can accelerate the aging process. And then we also know that if we think about brain cognitive aging, we know that chronic exposure to heavy metals can also lead quite a bit of inflammation in the brain, and then can really overwhelm those lymphatic processes in the brain to get rid of toxins. And then I think also we know that heavy metals can even influence DNA methylation and can actually hinder that process, and then make people more susceptible to certain developmental disorders. I know, again, from working with children and adults who've been sort of on the autistic spectrum, that we see a huge heavy metal burden in many of those patients.
Okay. I fact checked it, you're right. Last 100 years definitely has gone up. Last 50 years it hasn't. So that's the distinction. But I'm still not convinced that this disproves the heavy metal theory, because we had a lot of exposure to toxic metals 100 years ago, and even 200 years ago. It's just about one of the theories of the Roman Empire is that they ended through lead toxicity, right? So this is something that's been going on a long time, potentially. That some metals, at least, we would have been exposed to toxic levels of. Certainly, if you include things like iron and copper, these are things that we've had a lot of exposure to for a long time. There's also the issue of, so there's a lot more novel toxins now, but I think I remember reading that even some areas of the world, like like they talk about climate change, but there's a lot more people who die from cold than heat, in the sense that because it's cold, they burn fires, and through the smoke inhalation, they get poisoned by that and they die. And so most of our ancestors, unless we were in a warm climate all year round, we would have faced the choices of either freezing or being inside a structure where there was smoke, and we'd be constantly breathing in that smoke, which would be poisoning us with a variety of things, including heavy metals, right? So that's at least so long as we've had civilizations where we have contained dwellings and fires, we've been suffering from heavy metal toxicity from that, as well as food, as well as well water contamination, high iron, I just want to say, I don't think I think that we have way more toxins now than before because we've invented hundreds of thousands of them, but heavy metals has been something pretty consistent throughout at least civilization, is my understanding.
Yeah, I mean, I would say actually from that perspective, it's a little bit like with inflammation, that a lot of people have a chronic low level of inflammation that over time really builds up and causes causes issues with detoxification, puts stress on the organs, but we don't sort of notice it as quickly as somebody who would potentially get lung cancer from breathing in a lot of toxins, and then that would just be a sort of a quick way to go. So I almost feel that we're not necessarily suffering as much, unable to work and live, but often people are just not living optimally because they have that they have that low level kind of toxicity that is actually causing a lot of problems in the long term.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's more how heavy metals affect us, right? Unless it's acute, which is much more rare, I think, these days than 50 years ago, acute heavy metal poisoning throughout most of the world, certainly. But it's still, it's the chronic accumulation. So, okay, so should we move on to your favorite treatment modalities?
For heavy metals, yes. Yeah, so I am a fan of using oral chelators for testing and also for the treatment process. So I do like to use compounds like EDTA with alpha lipoic acid, particularly for mercury, arsenic, cadmium toxicity. Cadmium is a tricky one. That is one that often does take a long time to get into the system, and you often need to combine it with a lot of sweating. But I like to use that. I like to use DMSA as well. As you know, people have worked with me. I often use DMSA for the test, and then if there is a high level of heavy metals that we find, then I'll often continue that DMSA until you use it up, and then we'll often transition to a EDTA alpha lipoic acid combination. The idea being that the addition of the alpha lipoic acid, the alpha lipoic acid itself does have some metal chelating properties, but it's also a very potent antioxidant. So when you're actually releasing the metals from the organ, that is by in itself an inflammatory process. So we think that the alpha lipoic acid can make the sort of Hertzheimer reactions a little bit less severe.
Yeah. Yeah, and I remember you introduced me to DMSA. I'd heard a lot of negative things about it anecdotally, but when I looked at the studies on it, it seemed like it was actually highly effective, not only at getting the metals out, but like improving all kinds of health markers for people. So that was very interesting to me. There are a bunch of people, and it's not just random people in forums, it's a lot of health influencers who are very against it, though. A lot of them say it made them feel terrible, that it created a lot more problems than it solved. So do you have any idea why there is such a disparity between what the study showed, that it's pretty effective, versus what a lot of people's experience is, that they feel like it made them feel worse and sometimes it ruined them for years? This is what I've heard from people.
Yeah. No, it's interesting because I would say that depending on the dosing, if someone has a lot of heavy metal toxicity and their detoxification organs don't work very well, and you suddenly give them a high dose of DMSA, they're going to release a lot, and that can actually make them quite sick. So, so for certain people, I would actually use smaller amounts. Even for the testing, I would reduce the dose that people would take for the urine testing, like those who have kidney issues, some who have hypersensitivity. So I think it may be the case that they just went a little bit too strong with those chelators. But I've just found them to work better than the more kind of natural things like chlorella. I've just never found that to work. And there's some studies to suggest that it's actually not really doing very much chelating wise, that it's sort of moving things around, but then the metals just settle. So,
and chlorella, I guess is it the phial portion of it? Because a lot of these are phial, based formulas, right? Alpha lipoic acid is, DMSA is, EDTA isn't, but most of them are. So what about the argument I've heard, someone that almost everyone listening to this I think would have heard of, but I don't want to say in case it's wrong and I don't want to put words into the wrong person's mouth, but the argument that like the heavy metals when they're in the bones, like especially lead, but it can be other ones, right? Like I think cadmium as well, like they're fairly inert and harmless. And then when you take things like DMSA, you're actually liberating them where they could go to the brain or, create a lot more damage. What do you think of that argument?
I mean, it's interesting when I've always been taught that you just don't want that sitting in your bone. And, theoretically you could, by that logic, if you then have bone demineralization, wouldn't you be releasing some of those metals anyway? And so you're better off trying to do it in a controlled way rather than just leaving it and waiting for it to dissolve. A little bit like, it's kind of like with mercury fillings, you're saying that like actually if you have the mercury in you but the filling is intact, you're fine, which we know is not the case because you just get leaking.
Some people do say that. They don't say you're fine, but they say that like removing it is so toxic to the body that in some cases you might want to leave it. So I guess that's a similar argument.
Yeah, I guess it's, for mercury fillings, I would always advocate going to a dentist that uses this what we call the SMART protocol, where they actually are talking about like what you should be taking prior to removing the mercury filling and how you should be supporting the detoxification organs and the binders you should be taking. Because I agree, like if you just remove the filling and expose a person to a lot of mercury, it could cause them a lot of issues, and rather than helping them.
Well, let's talk about, I guess, the most common heavy metals a little bit then, before we finish. So let's talk about. Okay, we started with mercury. So mercury fillings is a big one. So you've just given you a recommendation for that. Do remove them, but do it the right way, right? The smart way. The other major mercury source that people have these days is fish. I understand it, right? Especially the big fish. Do you personally recommend people don't eat fish or not to eat big fish like tuna, or where do you stand on the spectrum there?
It's a really tough one because I used to say, avoid the bigger fish, or only get the smaller fish, and things like sardines, herring, anchovies. But I found, and I see that because when people are supposed to not have seafood for 2 weeks before they do their urine metals tests, and anyone that forgets and has one serving, we see their mercury go up. So I think at this point there's really no safe fish. But from a omega-3 protein perspective, say I just wouldn't be having fish every day, every meal. People that do, I always just see have sky-high mercury levels. So I would say I would have the fish in moderation, trying to have more of the smaller fish, but then I'd actually consider doing maybe milder chelating protocols in everybody every couple of years, because I just feel like it's unavoidable now.
So would you actually say that really everyone, like in a way, actually the people who most perhaps have a heavy metal issue, they're the ones who should be most careful of DMSA potentially, because they're more likely to have a negative response. But the normal, quote unquote, normal person who doesn't have heavy metal poisoning that they're aware of, but is just into longevity, that they would actually be smart to do like a regular metal chelation protocol like you just said.
I would, because I've seen heavy metals also impact sleep and energy levels, and we know that they cause oxidative stress. So if you're going to be investing so much in your longevity, you might as well just make sure that you're not, that you're making sure you're eliminating those toxins that inevitably will accumulate.
Mm-hmm. And I want to emphasize, I agree with what you said. Like, I think, unfortunately, things like chlorella and cilantro are completely useless for detox. But I will say, since I've been doing the high level of EGCG, I did a test recently of urine, and the lead was actually high in my urine, which I consider a good sign because it means my body's actually getting it out, which it normally wouldn't be. So, and EGCG is supposed to be a good lead chelator. So maybe EGCG is actually effective. Probably not as much as DMSA still. Well, definitely not. But for those who do not want to take a kind of a drug type thing, because EGCG is just a green tea extract, maybe that's something that would have some validity. Is there anything else kind of more natural that, although it's not as good and you don't recommend it as often, that you would say still is better than nothing?
Well, even I would say alpha lipoic acid on its own does have some chelating properties, and I have seen metal levels go down just by using that. Because when I've worked with children, some parents haven't really been on board with using ADTA, which I can understand. And if it was, a child that was otherwise functioning well, but they had an intermediate level of metals, I was respecting their wishes, and we would try binders plus things like alpha lipoic acid, and we did see some improvements.
And sorry, just to explain to people, because alpha lipoic acid kind of sounds like another chemical, but alpha lipoic acid is something that isn't a vitamin because it's something your body can make itself, but that's the point. It's something that your body can and does make itself, alpha lipoic acid. So unlike DMSA or EDTA, it's not like a foreign created chemical. It is something that your body makes itself, and just sometimes it struggles to make enough, and you can give it some extra from externally, right? So it is very natural, alpha lipoic acid, actually more than EGCG. EGCG is green tea extract, but it's still not something your body makes itself. So if you wanted things that are very natural, probably alpha lipoic acid makes sense to be at the top of the list, really.
In an ideal world, you'd meet all of your nutritional needs in the form of vitamins, minerals, phytonutrients, and more from the foods you eat. However, unless you prepare all of your food at home from scratch using the highest quality ingredients possible, the reality is that most of us need some nutritional support. Most of us need to take supplements if we want to look, feel, and perform at our best on a consistent daily basis. And this is especially true if you have genes that give you an elevated need of certain nutrients. And this is where Feel Younger can help. What I love about Feel Younger is that they offer a huge range of quality supplements and healthcare products formulated and endorsed by Elwin Robinson, including must-haves like magnesium glycinate and vitamins B12, D3, and K2. And they do it at affordable prices with free shipping for orders over $50 without ever compromising on quality, purity, or potency. To learn more about how Feel Younger supplements can give your health a boost while supporting this podcast, please visit feelyounger.net and use promo code Rejuvenate to get 20% off your first order. That's promo code Rejuvenate for 20% off your first order at feelyounger.net.
And so what else should we be doing to support detoxification in general, I guess?
I would say
of heavy metals.
Of heavy metals. I'm making sure that you're having daily bowel movements is a big one, and especially if I would say patients who maybe are on a more like lower FODMAP, carnivore, ketogenic style diet. One of the things I hear a lot is concerns with constipation. So that's one of the reasons why I'm always trying to push for a little bit of prebiotic or some sort of fiber, because I just find it's very instrumental for the detoxification process.
And so there's this push catch concept of you want to encourage your liver and gallbladder to push toxins, and then you want to catch them. So we've actually talked about catch already, which is the binder portion of things. But what about the push portion? What do you recommend to keep the liver and gallbladder and the bile flowing?
So I like to use things like certain herbs, certain like digestive bitters. I like to use things like magnesium citrate, but I would say from a kind of because gut motility I find is a huge issue, and one that I more frequently see gut microbiome imbalances because of motility and stress, and rather than and thyroid issues actually, but rather than necessarily what people are eating in their gut microbiome. I think the motility contributes to the poor microbiome. I really like to use also things like rhubarb, but like Chinese rhubarb, rhubarb root. because I'm not a huge fan of laxatives, even the more natural ones like Senna. I just find that can be overstimulating and really can contribute to a bit of a lazy bowel. Those are the things that come to my mind. There's more, but again, it kind of has to be a bit more personalized.
What about something for the liver like TUDCA or choline or anything like that?
Yeah, I do use a lot of TUDCA, particularly again when it looks like people are struggling with fat malabsorption. And also, I mean, even quite basic things, like I really like to use milk thistle, some of the herbs that, things like dandelion as well for kind of liver health. And choline, I tend to use more phosphatidylcholine, but I wouldn't say, it's just, again, there's so much you can use that I wouldn't say that it's kind of my first go-to particularly for liver health, but definitely does have some evidence to back it up.
Okay. And so we talked a bit about lead, because I always talk about lead, and we talked a bit about mercury. Any other heavy metal that you see a lot that you think is worth mentioning?
I see a lot of arsenic toxicity, and we think that might be as well because of people eating more rice, and rice and chicken are sort of the big ones that often come up. But I wonder also if people who are we see a lot more people avoiding gluten nowadays, but then they often are substituting it with rice, or rice-based products. So I wonder if that could be contributing.
And is there any special kind of arsenic detoxification thing, or is it kind of the usual stuff we've already talked about?
I find EDTA has been pretty effective for eliminating arsenic. And actually, I mean, these happen quite quickly. I would say that with a 6-week course of EDTA, I frequently see the metals go down by half. Not in everybody, but it isn't something that you're on for like years. It seems to be relatively quick.
And you're talking about a liposomal form, I believe, right? You're not talking about IV.
Yes, I only really use liposomal and oral forms. See, metal detoxification isn't really regulated, at least in the UK, but there's, I would say IVs, you have to be very careful. I would say I think it's just a bit too strong of a way to get rid of heavy metals. And if you're somebody who potentially could get sick with too strong of a dose of chelators, then the IV is just going to be that much stronger. So it wouldn't be my first choice.
Okay, great. And what about aluminium? I hear a lot about these days because I guess there's a lot of it in certain medications that people are taking. Do you actually see high levels of aluminium, especially when you do a provoking test to get people to, get metals out of storage, or in reality, in practice, are you not really seeing much of it? Sorry, and aluminum is what I'm talking about for my American friends.
Yeah, I was going to say, personally, that was the one I was high in when I studied kind of in an area that had an aluminum smelting factory about 100 kilometers away, but I had high levels of aluminum, and that seems to respond quite well to a lot of sweating, and so sauna. I did use EDTA for that as well. So I do see, I see it quite a lot. I didn't think about actually the aluminums added to processed foods. I was thinking it more from an industrial perspective.
The medications that they inject in children is what I was referring to. They've almost all got aluminium in these days, and there's theories about it. But okay, you're not seeing it much in people. Like, it's not like everyone's full of aluminium anyway. In practice.
I mean, in children, I would say I often see high levels of all the metals, and to me, that's more of a sign that that it's poor detoxification and not necessarily exposure to all of them. So yeah, I guess that's an important point to make. Like, if you're high in all the metals, then clearly it's more of an organ issue. Whereas if you're very high in one, we would suspect that it would be an exposure to something, not necessarily recent, but more of an acute exposure.
That makes sense. Okay. Just before we finish, the one other thing, and I think this is probably the last element of the mitochondria, because we're still kind of talking about that, right? Because heavy metals can really affect mitochondria. Mitophagy. So I think we talked about autophagy actually in the last episode. So that's like the recycling of cells, the body breaking down cells that are not working as well. And it's kind of like senolytics, I guess, are in that category that we talked about earlier, but that's specifically senescent cells. So mitophagy is mitochondria that are not working as well and recycling them, right? So what's your take on mitophagy? And do you do it? Do you recommend things for it? All that kind of stuff.
I mean, I think by the, in a way, as you said, it's similar process to senescent cells, but just mitophagy, just selectively degrading kind of the dysfunctional mitochondria, and we know that. So I do think it's worth trying to enhance mitophagy. Again, just going back to even exercise and movement, we know that's a very potent stimulator of mitophagy, and that's also where we kind of lump in things like calorie restriction that can promote mitophagy. It's a tough one though, because I know now a lot of people are coming off of the promotion of calorie. Well, no, I say calorie restriction. I think is still has a lot of evidence. It's more the intermittent fasting that I think some people are kind of finding that for optimal adrenal hormonal balance might not be the best. But
I was going to say, because it's spiking the adrenals when you're not eating for too long. Is that why?
No, yes, exactly. But I think it's quite interesting because
also suppressing the thyroid potentially, right? Which is a big deal when it comes to mitochondria.
I've always thought. I know we talked about the GLP-1 medications last episode, but I'm just quite curious with, people do tend to calorie restrict on, whilst on those sort of injections, if that's going to have a good effect on just longevity.
We'll see. I keep posting articles of people with new side effects coming up. The latest one was some famous singer who became blind, which apparently is a trend of happening to a bunch of people. But we talked about this in the last episode. When you're using it, you're using way less than the minimum amounts usually used, which I think is much more reasonable and sensible, and much, much less likely to lead to those kind of side effects. So I think people are massively overdoing it. They're already eating nutritionally depleted diets. They then artificially lower their hunger, and then they're even more nutritionally deficient. And of course, over time, that's going to cause severe problems. But there are some people who are eating just too much because of leptin intolerance, leptin resistance, various different reasons, and to just calm that digestion down a little bit so they're less hungry with a GLP-1. As long as it's not excessive, and as long as they're eating well, I can see how that would be beneficial. Which explains why some people, they do get benefit from it, right? They lose weight, they feel their insulin resistance gets better, a bunch of different markers get better, and good for them. So it is a case by case basis.
I know we think that there are some better GLP-1s than others, but what I find interesting is ideally if someone is calorie restricting, they then should be using the calories they are having to have the most nutrient dense foods. And what I have found is that some people who are, like, let's say, microdosing on certain GLP-1s, they seem to be in a better headspace to actually make those choices where they're like, okay, now I have my lunch and I know that I get full quite quickly, but I'm going to make I'm going to eat a very nutrient dense meal rather than going straight for like processed carbs. So I think that could be helpful.
Yeah, so I think so long as they're doing that, I think a lot of these cases of, where people look emaciated and all the rest of it is because they're not doing that, right?
Yeah, no, exactly.
So, okay, just back to mitophagy then. So, as you said, calorie restriction, exercise. What about, I think spermadine and Cybroxy are two that I'm familiar with that are quite powerful, herbal-ish, food-based, I guess, ones. What's your opinion on those?
Yeah, I took spermadine just for that reason, and I've recommended it for people who just want to take anything that could help, and it's a tough one because I think it's one that I think somebody would have to take long enough to see if they see improvements in some of their longevity markers, but I haven't seen that somebody notices something different when they then stop taking it. But I think it couldn't hurt. I think we need a bit more studies on spermadine.
Is there anything in that category that you do think is, more robustly evidence for it being worthwhile?
I know there's actually, I mean, this is more kind of on the pharmaceutical angle, but there is actually a few of the anti-worm, anti-parasitic medications that have actually been shown to enhance mitophagy.
I think we're allowed to talk about them on YouTube these days, so go ahead.
So I know there's one like, now I'm blanking the name of it. I'll look it up actually, but there's one that can activate a pathway. I think it's niclosamide. So that I'm quite interested in. I know there's been also, there have been some studies about using these sort of anti-helminthic drugs for other processes as well, immune regulating processes. But it's tough. I think we need more research of even, I would say, more people interested in longevity who are actively taking these and then seeing if they see improvements in their markers. But I mean, personally, other sort of like agents like MitoPure, which are just like ubiquinone type, I haven't really in clinical practice seen a big improvement in symptoms. And that's often what my patients are after, is they actually want to feel different. So you would need sort of a diligent person who's actually just taking it for the sake of trying to improve their markers on testing than necessarily feeling better, which most people I don't think would do.
Okay, well, that's a good place to finish with then. So in terms of actually feeling better, feeling younger, and it doesn't have to be what we just talked about. I guess it's anything over the last 2-3 episodes. It's up to you how many you want to say, top 1, top 2, top 3, like what's your most recommended?
Most recommended
strategies, I guess. It could be a substance, could be an activity, it could be a not doing something, just whatever.
I mean, movement, I would say, is probably number one. Just again, because of lymphatics, eliminating toxins, and one that I find people generally need more of nowadays. Two, I am a big fan of these antioxidants, so I'm a bit biased maybe now, but I am a big fan of EGCG particularly. So I would say...
Oh, really? In the last few weeks, that's shifted to number 2. That's interesting.
I have to say, so just for people who haven't been able to tolerate taking certain B vitamins, zinc, it's actually worked wonders for me and many of my patients, so I recommend that. It's... 3, I guess we're going to talk about this next, but I've been actually quite impressed with certain peptides, and particularly for feeling younger.
Let's do that as a preview for the next episode. Go for it, yeah.
And I've just been impressed at how...
No, sorry, tell us a couple and then we'll talk about them fully next time, so as a teaser.
Peptides like epithalon, ipamorelin, I found them very effective for even helping with regulating circadian rhythms. Some of my patients who've been chronic insomniacs or night owls seem to be getting sleepier with these, and then having better sleep, and then having more energy during the day. So I've been very impressed by that, and we know that sleep is so important for longevity. That should probably be that's the number 3. But I think the problem is that a lot of people struggle with their sleep. So but I would say that's been I've been quite impressed with that. MOTC, more from the mitochondrial perspective and helping to improve mitochondrial function. So those will be probably some of the more basic ones we've spoken about that I think there's enough people taking them that I would feel like we have a bit, at least some maybe more anecdotal evidence, but in larger numbers to justify their use.
And they actually work. That's the crucial thing that you're saying, noticeably so. All right, well, fantastic. We'll talk about that in the next episode. So you heard it. We talked about a lot of advanced things, but regular, frequent movement and sleep are still some of the top things, as always. But just because you heard it a million times before, don't dismiss it if it's something that you have trouble with. I mean, I honestly say, like, I still have issues with sleep. I've been honest about that. I've never been able to get to sleep early. I've never been able to sleep perfectly. Well, not never, probably since I was a child anyway. It's one of the things that makes things more difficult. I'm sure it's one of the factors as to why my mitochondria is not as good as it could be, although there's others. And so even if it's, and with exercise, for some people it's the same thing. They really struggle to get themselves to get up and move. But whatever it may be for you, just keep doing your best. Keep, learning new things, keep trying new things. These things are worth continually improving.
Yeah. No, and I would say that's where I think it would be time to get more personalized, because if somebody if somebody does have like an oxygenation issue, then certain things that might be considered a bit more new, maybe a bit controversial, like methylene blue, could potentially be a good. I've had some patients really have good improvements with that, but I wouldn't give it for everybody. I would sort of selectively use it for people who struggle with oxygenation, in conjunction with even some things like pomegranate, beetroot, things that can increase nitric oxide. So it really depends on what is preventing you from having good longevity. And so I think what is preventing you from exercising, from sleeping, from having optimal thyroid function. I know we didn't really touch on T3 as a longevity tool, but
I think we did it in the last episode with hormones. I'm not sure.
Maybe we did, but that's actually a tool that I will use for patients who might be struggling with even heavy metals, or things that we know that they're poor converters of T4 to T3. Might be another kind of strategy that's used.
It's worth mentioning in context of mitochondria, of course, because it's the thing that tells you mitochondria to work better, in essence, to create more energy. So definitely worth mentioning, yeah.
That should probably be my number 3 as well, because I definitely use it a lot in clinical practice, for the right candidate, of course.
Well, that's why I left it open as to how many you want to give. I didn't want to limit you to just 1 or 2 or 3. But yeah, that leads us perfectly into, I guess, the promotional part of this episode. So if you've enjoyed what you've heard, if you would like an individual, tailored, personalized approach, which is really what we would recommend. Oh yeah, I'd forgotten. That's actually the episode that we did 2 episodes ago, Dr. Miriam. We talked about the testing in the area of anti-aging and longevity. That's what we did. And I'm a big fan of that. And we did that before we gave any strategies, because we're giving strategies to give you suggestions and, ideas. But fundamentally, probably other than moving more and sleeping better, there's nothing we've mentioned here today that is universally going to be good for everyone. It's always case by case. And so it's really good to work with a practitioner who is experienced, and who is knowledgeable, and who is also open-minded, who understands a lot of different modalities, who really has a lot of the qualities that I look for in a practitioner. We did a whole episode on how to select a practitioner and the kind of qualities that you want in a practitioner. Dr. Miriam embodies most of them, if not all of them. And so I definitely recommend that she is someone who you would seek out if you want some help. And especially with longevity, because she has a whole practice dedicated to that. Tell us about that, Dr. Miriam. Tell us about it and where people would find out more about that.
Yes, I think because, with longevity, you have sort of some things that are medical, for example, like rapamycin and LDN that need to be prescribed, but you have all the nutritional components. It's actually ideal to work with a clinic where you can get both. So I've teamed up with my nutritionist colleague, who's also certified in functional medicine through IFM and has a lot of experience, particularly with hormonal balance, digestive issues. So that clinic is me and her together. It's called Health Miro. And that's where we are a primarily like testing based clinic, where we like to do things like true age tests, even blood tests, that are more comprehensive than what you would get through your kind of conventional family medicine doctor or GP. And yeah, and we're predominantly seeing people virtually. I do occasionally see people in the London area if you're interested. But if you would be interested, we do offer free 20-minute discovery calls. So if you just go to healthmiro.com, that's MIRO.com, it should be right at the top. Book in a discovery call, and we'd be happy to try and direct you into the right direction.
Fantastic. All right, thank you so much for doing this. We'll do at least one more episode at some point about peptides, because I know that's something that you're big on and something that people are very interested in. But for now, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing your expertise. It's been very interesting as always. And as always, I've learned something new.
Thank you again for having me, Elwin. And I appreciate also your constructive questions in the discussion.
Hey, thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed that, I recommend watching our latest episode, which you can do by clicking above. And make sure to subscribe, like the video, comment, and share with anyone who you think might appreciate it. Thank you.